Today I'm going to show you how to make one of these. Crustard of herbes on a Fisher Day. Or in other words, a tart for those days of the week when you're not allowed, if you're a good medieval Christian, to eat meat. So that's Wednesdays, Fridays and Saturdays. A crustard was in essence an open tart with an egg-based filling. The name in the 14th century probably meant something as simple as a dish cooked in a crust. That's a pastry crust, which would have been formed and baked inside a shallow earthenware dish known as a trap. Later, during the 15th century, the name starts to shift. So we start to see the word custard, appearing alongside crustard in the cookery works of the period. Today, custard usually refers to the filling, the egg-based filling that goes into one of these dishes, rather than to the pastry element of the dish. But it is interesting, isn't it, to find out the evolution of our modern day word custard. Having explained all of that, this particular crustard doesn't contain any eggs, or certainly not in the filling anyway, but rather it contains fish and a sort of egg alternative sauce. So it would have been suitable for Lent when even eggs were off the menu. The recipe it belongs to from Richard II's form of curry does give an option for eggs. If you want to make it without fish, it says, chop up some hard-boiled eggs and mix that with the sauce. But let me show you how I made my modern medieval crustard of herbes, my tart of salmon and greens. First, I make the crust in a trap, a pastry case in a dish. Today, I've decided I really want to enjoy the pastry, so I've gone completely modern. I'm really not a great fan of the basic medieval flour and water pastry. Remember, there's no lard or butter in medieval pastry. But if you want to make a tolerably good medieval pastry using eggs, see my video on custards. I'm seriously gluten intolerant, so I've gone here for a gluten-free short crust adapted from the Leith School of Food and Wine. As you see, I've added chilled butter, 100 grams or 3.5 ounces, to 200 grams or 7 ounces of gluten-free plain flour, blended with 1 level teaspoon of xanthan gum and a pinch of cooking salt. I pulse this in a food processor until it resembles fine breadcrumbs. Don't over-process it. By all means, work this in by hand, but use your fingertips. Good short crust pastry requires a light touch. If you're making non-gluten-free pastry, substitute wheat flour or use your normal recipe. Or be a complete cheat and buy some ready rolled pastry. I won't judge you. I next add 1 large beaten egg. I pulse this carefully until the dough starts to come together. Then I add 1 tablespoon of milk, you may need a little more, and pulse further until the dough forms large clumps. Don't go beyond this. If you wish, at the breadcrumb stage, you can transfer the mix into a mixing bowl before adding the egg and milk in there, bringing the dough together using a palette knife. Next, flouring my work surface, I press out the dough into a flat round shape, partly roll it out, and then wrap it up and put it into the fridge to rest for at least 20 minutes. Don't skip this stage. Resting it is important, especially for gluten-free pastry, and pre-forming the flat round shape means you can work quickly at the next stage, which is the trickier bit. Once rested, I roll out the pastry on a well-floured surface. Then I line a 25cm 10-inch metal flan tin. Pastry cooks better on metal, by the way. It ends up crispier. But if you insist on using that medieval earthenware trap you have, please feel free. I ease the pastry into the tin and make sure it fits in snugly where the base meets the sides and along the fluted edge. Then I trim off the excess pastry. I line the pastry with some baking parchment, pre-scrunched, and weight this down with baking beans. You can prick the pastry base if you wish before doing this. Before baking it, I let it rest once more in the fridge for about 20 minutes or so. I bake it in my fan oven at 160 degrees, so that's 180 in a non-fan oven, or 350 if you use Fahrenheit. After 10 minutes, I remove the parchment and baking beans and bake for a further 10 minutes at the same temperature. Medieval cooks also blind baked their pastry cases, so the medieval and modern are in tune here. You can make the filling for the crustard whilst the pastry is baking. Start by finely chopping 100 grams, that's 1 US cup, of walinotes, walnuts. I'm using the food processor again, but bash them to death in a mortar if you like. Then start chopping and mincing up your herbes, that is, your greens. I'm using a mixing bowl's worth, weighing in, before I removed the stems, at about 200 grams, that's 7 ounces. It's made up of half spinach, a quarter young cabbage leaves, and a quarter parsley, all picked fresh from my own garden, and all grown in medieval kitchen gardens. It's best to process the greens in batches. The medieval recipe asks for the mix to be ground small, so I'm going for a fine mince. I also add 100 millilitres, a little less than half a US cup, of verjuice. Verjuice is the juice of sour grapes, or sometimes crab apples, and was produced in the south of England during the medieval period. Today you can buy it in salted and unsalted forms. I'm using the unsalted. I also add a drizzle of good olive oil, not in the original recipe at this stage, as I have a theory it helps to keep the greens greener. And I add some spices, half a teaspoon each of powder douce and powder fort. You can find recipes for these medieval spice blends on my blog. I then add 125 millilitres, a dribble over 1 US cup, of cold water. And this really helps to mince it all up very finely. I put the mixture into a saucepan and add a pinch of salt, even though the recipe says not to add salt. I think it says this because the verjuice the medieval cook was using may have been, unlike mine, already salted. The recipe says to seethe it well, simmer or boil it well. I'm looking to almost dry out the mixture so that when it gets put into the pastry case, there's no chance of that infamous soggy bottom. This does take quite a few minutes, as there is a lot of water in greens, especially spinach. The next thing I do is put my raw salmon into the blind-baked pastry case. I had already skinned 4 small salmon fillets weighing about 480 grams, 17 ounces, and cut them into chunks. Following the recipe, I tossed them in olive oil and spices, a half teaspoon of powder fort. I also added a generous pinch of sea salt. Now I'm arranging the salmon evenly inside the crust. You don't have to use salmon. The recipe simply says do a fish therein. I've tried it with a mixture of haddock and salmon, but I prefer all salmon. I think it goes really well with the greens. I should add too that it's not only the fish that isn't specified in the medieval recipe, but the spices too. It simply says to use poudre, powder, which typically indicates a spice mix. So do give my mixes for powder fort and powder douce a go. They're based on a contemporaneous Italian text, as there are no English recipes. This now goes into the oven, fan 160 degrees Celsius, non-fan 180 or 350 Fahrenheit, for 7 minutes. After the 7 minutes, or as the original recipe puts it, when it is half ibaka, half baked, then it's time to add the greens to the crust. So I spoon it around the chunks of salmon and fill the gaps in. There is enough mixture to almost cover the salmon, leaving just enough of its coral pink showing to pique curiosity. This now returns to the oven, still at the same temperature, for a further 7 minutes. Did King Richard ever eat a crustard? Well, a gretta crustuda was served him during the second course of a feast laid on by Baron Thomas de Spencer around about 1397. Looking at the other items on the menu, this wasn't a crustada for a fish day, as there were roasted meats galore. Anyone for roasted curlew? How was this great crustard eaten? Well, we have a clue. Though written quite a few decades after Richard died, the Book of Nurture, the poetic work on domestic manners and management by John Russell, suggests the king may have been served his crustard in small squares, since, according to Russell, custard was to be checkered butcher, carved checkered, square with the canifa. Very dainty. I think Richard would have liked this one. Gluten-free pastry and all. Please consider supporting my video channel by subscribing to my premium content, only available through my website. The link is in the description.